Hey, how's it going?
Voila. I love it. I love it when the technology works.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited about our conversation. This is my first time like really using Instagram Live, so I'm very excited about this and thanks for joining us for this conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I see the books in the background. Nice. Very good. Okay.
And the products, we have our Madam Walker products from MCJW
Okay.
available at Sephora. You know,
Okay.
these are made by Sundial Brands, so
Mhm.
very proud of them.
Is there anything I can use it for, or probably not?
Yes.
Yeah. Is it?
Is there a hair pomade for men? But
Okay.
it works on everybody.
Okay. Great. Well, let's get right into it.
All right.
Let's start with the miniseries.
Sure.
I think most people understand that it was a dramatization. It was inspired by her life, right? And it's difficult to fit the life of someone so dynamic into a Netflix series. But everyone wants to know your thoughts about the miniseries, how you felt about some of the let's say creative liberties that Netflix took with Madam C.J. Walker and A'Lelia Walker's life.
Sure. Well, Octavia Spencer is fabulous. I think that she really gives you a sense of who Madam Walker's courage and tenacity and the arc of a story from the life that she began on a plantation in Delta, Louisiana, the struggles and the sacrifices that she went through, and then how she ended up as a millionaire who empowered other women, who employed other women, who
Mm.
became a philanthropist and a political activist. Though truly, I've written a book that's 270 pages, 20 years worth of research,
Mm.
75 pages of
Oof,
endnotes.
they don't know about that.
There's right. So I really do
Mm.
hope people will read the book.
Yes.
Really read the book, because there's no way to put all of this life into 45 minute episodes.
Mm.
And we don't really learn our history when we're growing up. So there's a lot that I did to try to create context and historical context. And what happens in Hollywood is very different from what happens for me as a journalist and for me as a biographer, when
Mm.
I'm really sticking to the facts, and everything that I put in my books can be documented. But creative license is something that I think most people who understand how Hollywood works knows that you write a book,
Yeah.
and even Stephen King, has written books that don't turn out the way that he intended them to. So,
Sure.
my overall feeling about it is Octavia Spencer is great. Millions of people now know who Madam Walker is.
Yes.
And now it gives me an opportunity to tell Madam Walker's story, to tell the facts of her story.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that people should know about Madam Walker and her daughter that were omitted from the miniseries?
So I think that for me, what's really important about her life is that she was nurtured, mentored, empowered by other women.
Mm.
And part of that is how she got to the point of doing that for other women. When she was the poor Sarah Breedlove McWilliams, widowed at 20, who moved from Louisiana, Mississippi, along the Mississippi River to St. Louis, she had three older brothers who were barbers who were there.
Mm.
And she began to learn the hair care business from her brothers. Their barbershop was very near St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Okay.
And it was the women of the church, like Jessie Batts Robinson, a school teacher, who really began to give her a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate washerwoman. These women were part of national organizations. So that's where she really got this idea of organizing women. So through that and carrying through the story, she starts a company. Yes, she works for Annie Malone for a while, but for a short while. And then she begins to develop her own business, and she establishes a company. She trains thousands of women. She becomes a patron of the arts, a political activist who supports the anti-lynching movement,
Okay.
and a patron, and involved in so many other things. So that part, the philanthropy, gets really telescoped in the series, and her political activism really gets telescoped.
Yeah, it's like we were saying before, it's really hard to fit like her life into a miniseries. I mean, because I know I was one of them. I was one of the people who were very excited when we heard about like this miniseries about Madam Walker, who is someone that I would probably say has not really been she really hasn't gotten her due in as far as like media coverage or like shows or like television Hollywood. And so I was very excited, you know, to see it. And it was, I think one of the things that the miniseries really did well was capturing like the time period. And, like the costumes were amazing, the setting was amazing, and like you said, Octavia Spencer was amazing. But let's talk a little bit about your book. The series is based off the book, you know, or loosely based off the book. And you published a new edition of the biography, which you published on last week, Tuesday.
That's right, on the 24th.
Yeah, yeah. And so it was.
So that's what you see back here.
Yeah, yeah. And so it was originally titled "On Her Own Ground: The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker," but you renamed it "Self-Made" for the movie tie-in. What should people expect to see in the new edition?
So I've written a new epilogue, and I really give people this book was first published in 2001. A lot of things have happened with that I've been involved in, a lot of Madam Walker initiatives since then. And so you see Madam Walker, artists are using her. There are many books in which she's mentioned. I have more than 200 books on my shelf that mention Madam Walker as inspiration. The Madam Walker Legacy Center in Indianapolis, a National Historic Landmark, has just undergone a $15 million renovation. The Indiana Historical Society we were able to donate thousands of papers of Madam Walker's letters and photographs and business records. Those have now been digitized, and there's a new exhibit at the Indiana Historical Society. But I just try to bring people up to date on all of the things that have happened since the book. I've also made some corrections in the book. You know, anybody who is a journalist or a writer who works with facts, every now and then you have something that you didn't get quite right. So I've done things like little things like change slaves to enslaved, because that is a more useful, that is used more now by scholars, and I like that, saying that. One other thing that I have updated, when I wrote the book originally, I could see that because we have, as we say, the receipts, we can really document everything financially about Madam Walker. I estimated her personal estate to be between $600,000 and $700,000 at the time of her death. Her cars, her jewelry, etc. But I was speaking at a business school, and one of the professors said to me, you know, when you were doing this estimate, you left out the value of her company. And when you look at the sales for the last 2 years of her life and the year after, one of those years was almost $600,000, which would doubled that.
Yeah.
So that person said to me, if she had sold her business on the day she died, it would have been worth between $1 and $2 million. So I have updated that with those numbers. And there are lots of people who, you know, want to argue about who was the first, who wasn't the first. That's not really that important to me. What's important to me is the legacy that Madam Walker left, the generational wealth she created, the women she empowered, the causes she was involved in.
Yeah, so speaking about women from sort of like the time period, let's talk a little bit about Annie Malone, right? So she is basically, there's a character, for those of you that may not have seen the miniseries, there's a character, Addie Monroe, who is kind of loosely based off of Annie Malone. And, you know, she is the primary antagonist in the miniseries. But in the Midwest, she's like a legendary figure, you know, and so a lot of people took how she was portrayed in the film personally, and I think that I read that she was a mentor of sorts to Madam Walker. And so I think it's important to realize that they had a relationship, but it's important to kind of talk about what was the basis for their relationship. How can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. What did you think about that character?
What did I think about the character? I think that, you know, there were some parts where we were trying to be maybe sort of sympathetic, you know, because I remember there was one scene when she moved to Indiana. She had a black eye, so she was in like a abusive relationship. There were some parts of it where they wanted us to kind of sympathize with her a little bit, but she was kind of dramatically maybe exaggerated for kind of like comedic effect almost, as far as like how she tried to go after Madam Walker.
Yes, yeah. So I mean, listen, what I have written in my book, in Self-Made, originally titled On Her Own Ground, I did a lot of original research about Annie Malone. I
Okay.
think the writers of this series, the head writer and the showrunners, will say when they are asked about this, they have said that they don't intend for Addie Monroe to be Annie Malone, that she is a
Right.
composite character.
Mm.
I think that many people have drawn that conclusion, that they think that there is some parallel, because in real life, Madam Walker's primary competitor was Annie Malone. So
Right.
when I was doing the research for On Her Own Ground, I did a lot of original research on Malone. So this is in the late 1990s, when no other scholars had really been writing about her, and
Okay.
certainly hadn't done the level of primary source original document research that I did. What I found, and this is I'm gonna try to make this long story short, but I think this is really important for people to understand, that because we have literally tens of thousands of records of Madam Walker's life, business records, personal letters, I can tell her story in much more detail than people who are trying to tell Annie Malone's story, because
Mm.
she had so many ups and downs. She lived a lot longer. And so those records are just not there. So a lot of times numbers are pulled out of thin air.
Yeah.
But in my research, I documented that Madam Walker was a Malone agent. I always say, whenever I talk about her and when I write in the book, that she is an important historical figure, an important entrepreneur, a philanthropist, a person who trained thousands of Black women. So I see them as equals. And
Okay.
that's the way I've always talked about them. So what does Alelia Bundle say about Annie Malone? She and Madam Walker are equals, and they are rivals.
Okay.
Now, there is a Malone biographer who started calling her Madam Walker's mentor. My research suggests that it was a much more transactional relationship and not a mentoring relationship. Madam Walker's mentors were Jessie Batts Robinson, a school teacher who was in St. Louis, who was in her church, and who later ran her St. Louis beauty school.
Okay.
Another mentor was Alice Kelly, who was a former dean of girls at a Black boarding school in Kentucky, who became the manager of her factory. So those were her mentors. Now, in the, what I know about Annie Malone, she never moved to Indianapolis. She and Madam Walker made some really different decisions that I think in the long run made a difference. Annie Malone married a man, Annie Turnbow married a man named Aaron Malone in 1914. This is when both women were just kind of really, at that point they were really taking off. But
Okay.
Aaron Malone undermined Annie Malone, harmed her business. They had a horrible divorce. Then she had tax problems. And so there were a lot of reasons where she didn't flourish. Madam Walker hired F.B. Ransom, who protected her. Madam Walker died in 19 at the height of her fame. And she was in New York, and it was on a bigger platform. So there are a lot of reasons, but that for me doesn't say both women were very important.
Okay, for sure. And speaking on that, maybe we can talk a little bit, and you just touched on this, but maybe we can talk a little bit about how Madam Walker inspired other Black women around her. I do think the miniseries did a good job of showcasing how she brought Black women to her cause. Like, for example, the scene in the market where she started telling people about hair. Let's talk about hair. Let's talk about hair, and she brought people to her, to support her in her cause, or her interactions with the National Association of Colored Women. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
That was one of my favorite scenes. I love that because she's just like, anytime you're trying to sell something to somebody that they aren't already familiar with, you get those cold phone calls, those cold calls. You're like, I'm not talking to you. And you could just see how she was drawing them in. And I think that was very much a part of who she was, because she had been those women. She had been that woman who didn't have enough money, who couldn't get a job, who was put down by other people. So she knew that story, and that was part of her strength. As she and CJ, they moved from St. Louis to Denver. She actually moved first, started selling Malone's products, and then Charles Joseph Walker joined her. Again, he was very helpful to her initially, but she kind of outstripped him in ambition. But as they traveled around the United States, she would do a lecture, and she had something that was really kind of like a PowerPoint called a stereopticon
Okay.
glass slides that were shown in a projector. And she would go to a town, take out an ad before she got there, do a lecture that was about Black current events and education and business. Then she would assemble a group of maybe 10 to 15 women downstairs in the basement at the church and recruit them as agents. And she had such a good eye for picking leaders that she would see who asked the best questions, who did other women gravitate towards, who had charisma. She would make that woman her lead agent, and then she would go on to the next town. But she knew how to empower other women. She had the National Association of Colored Women, the way those women are portrayed in the film is a bit different from the reality. That group was founded in 1896 before the NAACP. These were women who had traveled internationally. They weren't women who were happy to be in the kitchen. They would have said no to the kitchen.
Yeah.
But she observed those women when she was still a poor washerwoman. They had their 1904 convention in her church in St. Louis.
Okay.
And she knew the power of that. So when she had her first convention of her sales agents in 1917, she was modeling it on the National Association of Colored Women. And she saw this component. She gave prizes not just to the women who sold the most products, but to the women who had contributed the most to charity. And they sent a telegram to the president to urge him to support legislation to make lynching a federal crime. So this was about power. This was somewhat about the hair products, but ultimately about political power.
Okay, and so I'm glad you are bringing up political power, because what the Netflix series really didn't do a great job of, and they kind of touched on it at the end, was talking about her political activism and her philanthropy. Back then she gave money to students at Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute to help them cover tuition. She donated money to the NAACP. What are some other things that she pretty much helped out as far as her political activism?
Right. So I will say in those 4 episodes, initially it was supposed to be 10 episodes. So, so I think that it's very, very hard for them to, even with that, with 10 episodes, they probably could have had a couple of episodes where they would have done more of that. So I think they wanted to do more. But yes, it is. Madam Walker's involvement with lynching really goes back to her childhood. When she was growing up in Delta, Louisiana, there were 90% of the people after the Civil War were Black because of all the cotton. Her family minister was elected to the state Senate in Louisiana. And then he and her brothers were chased out of Louisiana by the Ku Klux Klan around the time of the 1876 election. So she had seen that there were some seeds planted, but you couldn't get that sense of it into the film. And the Sweetness character is an invented character, but that was, I think, the way that the writers were trying to make sure they introduced Madam Walker's interest in lynching. But in fact, she was very much involved, speaking out. And as you people who've read my book know, this is not in the film, that she and Ida B. Wells were spied upon by a Black spy from the War Department during World War I and called Negro subversives, mainly because they were speaking out. I mean, it's just that they were speaking up for Black people. Yeah,
and so to your book again, because people are asking about your book now. They want to know, like, where can they find it? Is it online? Is it a downloadable version? How can they find it?
Yes, you can absolutely. So here's the book. And it is in paperback. If you go to Amazon and do self-made Madam Walker, because there are a lot of things named self-made. So do self-made Madam Walker. You can buy the audiobook, Kindle, paperback on Amazon.com, on BarnesandNoble.com. And also you can come to my website, which is AleliaBundles.com, ALELIA Bundles. You can see that also the same name that's in my Instagram. AleliaBundles.com and MadamCJWalker.com. We spell Madam with no E, MadamCJWalker.com. So if you ordered on my website, I will autograph it, but you will get it more quickly if you go to Amazon, because I have about 50 orders that I'm personally doing the fulfillment on.
Okay. Well, the audiobook comes highly recommended too, so definitely check out the audiobook as well.
Yeah, I recorded it about 6 weeks ago. So there hadn't been an audiobook. We'd held the rights to that when the book first came out. But that was kind of fun because, I was a television news producer for 30 years. So it was fun to be on the other side of the microphone.
Yeah.
In the audio. Booth.
Let's talk a little bit about A'Lelia Walker.
Sure.
So for those of you just tuning in, Tiffany Haddish portrayed her in the miniseries. You're writing a book about her, right?
Yes, so I'm almost finished with the first major biography of A'Lelia Walker called The Joy Goddess of Harlem, A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance. So I've done additional decades worth of research. In the biography of Madam Walker, I developed the relationship between the two women. And what I found when I was writing that book is that there were most of the things that people knew about Madam Walker were incorrect. And I'm finding as I was doing this research, most of the things people know about A'Lelia Walker are incorrect. She's portrayed as a party girl. She's very different from the character who appears in the series. She's very much a patron of the arts for a long, and there's actually, if people go to my website, AleliaBundles.com, I have an article titled, on the blog titled, The Real A'Lelia Walker is Much More Interesting Than the Myth. And I have just discovered she knew everybody, all the artists and musicians and writers. She hosted the first art show for Augusta Savage, who was a very famous Black woman sculptor. She helped to underwrite some things. She hired a lot of Black musicians. She also was really kind of an impresario, and she knew how to have big events that would get attention. She traveled internationally to London, Paris, Rome for the coronation of the Pope. Addis Ababa, where she met the Empress of Ethiopia. So she's a much more substantial character. So it's really kind of painful to me to see people sort of over and over again basically say Madam Walker made the money, she spent the money. So I'm hoping that this new book will give her her due, which she deserves.
And when should we expect that book?
So it will be out next year. So
okay.
I have, because there's so much excitement right now, I haven't been able to do a lot of writing for the first quarter of the year. But once I get to mid-April, I'm really going into deep writing mode so that it can be out next year.
Great. Okay, and so the miniseries, it depicted her as sort of like you were saying, like this party woman, free-spirited. She was also depicted as a queer woman. And so, I've been reading, it seemed like there was no concrete evidence that she was, but according to an interview, we did an interview with Tiffany Haddish that was actually published today. So if you all are listening, go to HuffPost and read our interview that we had with her. The show's writers really wanted to lean into the rumor that she was bisexual. Could you tell us a little bit about her backstory with this? Because I think I read that her last relationship was with a woman.
Right. And that's because that's the story that I tell. So, the storyline in the series, Esther is not a real character. I do not think that she would have been as out, certainly in the early 80s when I was interviewing a lot of A'Lelia Walker's friends who were still alive, and many of whom were queer. They talked about the difference between the way people operated then and now. So people were very much more circumspect. So it would not have been out. And there was nothing that I have ever found in literally 50 years of research that suggested to me that she had a relationship with a woman during her mother's lifetime. So there would have been no conflict between her and her mother in real life. And so I don't know, the writers really are the ones who would have to talk about what their motivation and objective was with that character. The real conflict between mother and daughter during her lifetime was between two boyfriends, both doctors, both handsome. Madam Walker preferred one over the other. I write a great deal. I developed those relationships. Now, a lot of A'Lelia Walker's friends were queer. A lot of people who were at her parties, people who were queer and who weren't queer were very much a part of her circle of friends. She had a wide circle of friends. What I have discovered, and this is truly circumstantial, and I have no letters, I have no documentation, and I am a journalist, and so I really operate on what I can prove. But my sense is that there is a relationship with a person who was a longtime friend, but I have no concrete evidence. But as you do when you are writing nonfiction, I will try to artfully discuss this relationship. So in
Okay.
Joy Goddess, I will be talking about it for people who are curious and for whom that matters.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, her life was amazing. She was hanging with Countee Cullen, Langston Hughes, like all of these sorts of like just famed Harlem Renaissance poets and artists, and it just really seemed like kind of an amazing time. And the Dark Tower, right? Like which was portrayed. What would you say about that?
Yeah, so
That
that, I
scene?
mean, so again, that was collapsed a bit. It was really not in the salon. I mean, I think they were
Mm,
trying to bring the two together. But again, you would
yeah.
have to ask them. But the Dark Tower really happened after Madam Walker's death. So Madam
Okay.
Walker died in 1919. It was, and I have to give Lelia this real important credit that when Madam Walker moved to Indianapolis in 1910, Lelia remained in Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh was never in the series, but
Mm,
she was running the Pittsburgh office, but her territory was the East Coast. And both of them visited New York. But when Lelia visited New York, it was obviously much more interesting than Pittsburgh at the time.
yeah.
No disrespect to Pittsburgh, but Harlem was
Mm,
becoming the mecca for Black culture and politics during that period of time. And she
mm,
convinced her mother that they needed to have a presence in Harlem. So they bought a building on 136th Street. And I have the original picture, and then they remodeled it. Vertner Tandy, the Black architect, one of the founders of
oh, I
Alpha
know
Phi
him.
Alpha.
Oh yeah, I know him well.
That's right. So he did the architecture. He had just designed St.
Mm,
Philip's AME or Methodist Episcopal Church. I'm sorry, St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Harlem. And then they expanded it and bought the building next door and built this incredibly fabulous salon and living quarters and beauty school. So it
mm,
was really, and I think that's again part of the reason Madam Walker is more remembered is because Lelia had this sense of drama and being an impresario, like we need to be in Harlem. So
yeah.
then Madam Walker dies in 1919. The school is still there. But Lelia, at that point, Lenox Avenue, it's very near Lenox Avenue, is starting to get just way, way too busy. So Lelia takes an apartment, a pied-à-terre, at 80 Edgecombe Avenue, and the
Mm,
building on 136th Street becomes strictly commercial. And she, in 1927, because she is the one who can host parties and who can be a patron of the arts, her friends persuade her that she needs to create some gathering place. And that's when she opens the Dark Tower. On
okay.
one wall is Langston Hughes's poem, The Weary Blues, and on another wall is Countee Cullen's poem, The Dark Tower.
Mm, yeah, that's amazing.
And
There.
it is truly one of the most, whenever anybody writes about the Harlem Renaissance, they write about that. And I would say there's a lot of stuff, a lot of people who I like, people whose work I respect, but who don't get her right when they write
Mm,
about the Harlem Renaissance. It's the same paragraph over and over again. So who I think is accurate about her, Langston Hughes's book, The Big C, and
okay.
Carl Van Vechten's book. There's a book called Keep an Inch and Along with an unpublished profile of her that was originally to go in the New Yorker.
Okay. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think people need to definitely. I might have to put out like a just reading list.
Yes.
From you, so that people can kind of get the full story of just both of their lives. And
Right.
I think.
I'm so there for that because I
Mm,
have like a list of 42 things that I need to do to help educate people. And reading list bibliography is one of them.
mm.
So happy to work with you on that.
Okay, well, great. So there's one thing about her character. Back to the miniseries, Tiffany Haddish or her character was not. She was not. Let's say she wasn't excited to start to get into the family business. And so did that have any like basis in reality, or was she always from the get-go ready to kind of be in the family business?
I think she was. I can see that in the
Mm,
very early on, she was very involved in the business. She's the one who wanted to move to New York. It was her idea. She was in the letters, in their almost daily letters to the attorney. She is talking about, I'm so happy that this is how much money we made last week. I'm
mm,
eager to show mother how much I made, and I'm eager to pay mother back. She's lent me this money to do this remodeling. I'm eager to pay her back. So my sense is that she was very engaged. I think that over time, she became less engaged. She was in New York. The company was based in Indianapolis, and it was really Mr. Ransom who was running the day-to-day operations with Alice Kelly. And after she had, her mother died, she married the bad boy, Dr. Wiley Wilson, and he kind of acted up the way that her mother had predicted. And then she went on
Mom
this
always
long
knows.
trip. Yeah, mom knows.
Mom knows.
It's like, this is why, for me, the facts are more dramatic than some fiction sometimes. I think that's why I'm excited about the chapters that I've written on these relationships. And then she married the other Dr. Kennedy. But there was her personal life was getting very difficult. And so I think she was kind of disheartened and probably depressed about that. If you have a heartache, a heartbreak, that makes it hard for you. I mean, I think she was normal in that sense. And everybody was comparing her to her mother. You can't be the original founder is always going to be the bright light, and you can never, ever live up to it. So I think that some of the disengagement on her part really came after her mother's death. But she was always thinking about things to do. When she went on this trip to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, she went to the Holy Land. Her first idea when she got back was, let's have a contest for Black ministers so that we can send them on a Holy Land trip. And she traveled around making lectures about that. So I would say she was really engaged.
Yeah, it seemed, I was really just curious about that, just because it seemed like she had to kind of work away. And, that was obviously Hollywood's decision to kind of figure that out. But yeah, that was something I was curious about. Also,
I will also say one of the things, I was really, in the 80s, I had written my master's paper at Columbia in journalism school on Madam Walker because my advisor was the only Black woman on the faculty. He told me that's what you're going to write about. But I then spent the next decade doing research, and there were still some of those Harlem Renaissance survivors who were around. People like Alberta Hunter and Jimmy Daniels and Geraldine Disman, who you are not old enough, but when Jet was a big deal, there was something called the Society column, and she was Jerry Major. She was one of A'Lelia Walker's best friends and a Society columnist. And Romery Bearden, we know his work as an artist. His mother Bessie was also a Society columnist, so they wrote about what she was doing every single week in the newspapers. And I interviewed Jerry and just maybe about a dozen people who had known her. And the way they described her life, you really got a sense of it. They told me who she was, what her personality was like. And Alberta Hunter, who at that point was in her 80s and singing at the Cookery, a club in Greenwich Village, told me that A'Lelia Walker had a great singing voice. So I got that from, so people who don't know who Alberta Hunter is, Google Alberta Hunter.
Okay.
But I will just add this, but she knew her friends were more talented. And so when she had pianos and organs and harps in her homes, and she always had that so her friends could perform. But she knew she couldn't, be as good as she enjoyed them.
Okay, because there is a scene in the miniseries where she's singing, and it's just like, nah, no, she's not the best singer in the world.
Right, yeah.
For
but
sure.
I mean, it's Alberta Hunter who told me that.
Okay, so like I said before, we spoke with Tiffany Haddish in a recent interview, and she said that there's been some talks with the showrunners about a miniseries based on A'Lelia's life. Is that something that you've been, I don't know if you heard about that, or if that's something that you might be interested in helping out with?
Well, my contract for this particular series indicates that my book on A'Lelia Walker is a separate intellectual property.
Right.
So I would be interested in developing that and having a lot of say in how that unfolds.
Yeah, no, I think that would be great because, I mean, her life, like, just after Madam Walker's, her death and the things that she's done after that, seems like it would be a great story. I'm not sure if I would want to see Tiffany Haddish in it, but that's just me.
And what did you think?
About the whole film. Let's see. Well, what I liked most about it was I was definitely excited to hear about this miniseries, just because, like I said before, we've never really gotten that and from a Netflix or any movies or anything like that I'm aware of, right? And so I'm really excited about kind of like the uh, energy that is surrounding this inspired interest about Madam Walker all over again.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so the miniseries, it, you know, it was, yeah, it was something. But you know, I was kind of, I had a, you know, a time watching it.
Well, you know, I will say this, that I think that as African Americans, we feel an ownership of some of our very famous historical figures.
Yeah.
And there are some Hollywood treatments that stay closer to the accurate story. And there's some that really use a great deal of creative license.
Yeah.
And obviously this is not a documentary. And I was actually not involved in the concept, the early concept and the dramatic arc and the creation of the characters. The contract allowed me to have script review. And so after the scripts were written, I was able to read the scripts and offer notes and offer suggestions. And some of those suggestions were incorporated and many of them were not. So it is a story that really is the creation of the writers. And that's sort of the bargain that the writer makes when you allow something to be optioned and for people to tell the story. Yeah. But I think that, as often happens, because it is very sad to me as a journalist and a fact-based person, that we don't learn history very well. It's better than it was when I was in school, but you know, generations after generations either don't learn anything or they learn things that aren't accurate. So it really is left up to us to try to find the facts. And now it is easy to find the facts if you want to find the facts. So what, for me, the takeaway now is that Madam Walker, because of Octavia Spencer's incredible performance, is now known by millions of people around the world. I can't tell you how many Instagram messages I've gotten from people in Brazil. You know, it's like, who knew? But you know, I've been invited to speak in Brazil. So this now is an opportunity for people to really dig more deeply, to learn more about not just Madam Walker and Annie Malone, but to learn more about Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, who are, you know, whose families are not very happy with the way they are portrayed.
Yeah, there's a lot of conversation around this whole.
And then F.B. Ransom. Now, Mr. Ransom, I'm going to post something, I hope later today. I have so much going on right now, but it's on my long list. F.B. Ransom was such an amazing person. He really crossed the T's and dotted the I's. He protected Madam Walker from some of the kind of legal issues that, you know, that Annie Malone was not protected from. He made sure that the factory, that things were ordered, that the records were kept, that the supplies were coming in. He was really just a straight arrow. And he was very much a straight arrow. He, while, you know, sweetness is there as a device to show certain themes that the writers wanted to show, Mr. Ransom was not betting on the numbers. That he would not. And you know, his grandchildren are friends of mine. One of my best friends from childhood, Judy Ransom, lived 2 doors down from me. You know, I can still see us playing jacks, you know, on the floor. His grandchildren, Jill Nelson and Stanley Nelson. Stanley is the documentary filmmaker who did the HBCU movie and the recent Miles Davis movie. So you know Stanley's work. His very first film was $2 and a Dream about Madam Walker. His sister Jill is a very well-known journalist. So these are friends of mine, and then they have many cousins. So they know the story of their grandfather. And I'm trying to, you know, make sure that I'm writing as much as I can about him. He's certainly a key character in my book because Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker are writing to him almost every day. Yeah, no, his character was one of the redeeming male characters in the in the miniseries. And everyone roasting me in the comments about the film. Everyone should go see it, go watch it, and you know, come up with your own thoughts about it. Definitely. But you know, I really do hope people watch it. I mean, this is I 95% of the comments that I've received are people who are inspired by it, especially in these very difficult times, who have said they're going to reactivate their business, who see positive things, who can see the struggles that Madam Walker had. So absolutely watch it. I mean, what we should not expect is that it's a documentary.
Yeah.
We should not expect that it is entirely factual. That is not what this series is doing. What this series does is give you a little flavor of the emotion and the struggles and some of the highlights of what Madam Walker accomplished and some of the people she affected. So see it and find the inspirational parts. Check out the wigs, if nothing else. I mean, the hair is
They did a good job.
incredible.
Yeah, they did a good job.
Costumes, the sets. So many people worked so hard on this.
Mm.
The number of people I'm told who turned down other jobs because they wanted to tell Madam Walker's story, who worked so hard. I was able to spend one day on the set to see Demaine Davis, the director, in action with the two scenes. One, the scene in the hotel room, which is, no spoilers, but that's a deep scene. And then the scene where F.B. Ransom is telling Madam Walker about what happened to Sweetness. So those are so, I mean, there's some of the acting, Kevin Carroll, Octavia Spencer, Blair Underwood, Carmen Ejogo. I mean, so there's some very strong,
there's some heavy
acting.
hitters.
So see that and celebrate it, because the more successful these films are, it was #1 on Netflix last weekend. The next time something gets made, maybe it will be closer to the truth. But the deal is we really do have to support it. And we have to, it's good that people are talking about it. It's good that people are expressing their opinion. So even if you don't like everything, still watch it and then read the book.
Absolutely. Okay. And so thank you again. I think that that's a great way to end it on. Thank you again for spending your time with us. I know you're very busy. So thank you so much for spending your time. Can you just tell us again your book, where people can find your book, and what are you? Where can people find you? I guess next. What's my
next thing?
Yeah. What's your next big?
All right. Here's the book. Self-Made, originally titled On Her Own Ground, the inspiration for this fabulous Netflix series, #1 Netflix series starring Octavia Spencer. I am finishing The Joy Goddess of Harlem, A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, that will be published by Scribner, the same publisher, next year. I don't know the date yet because I'm not quite finished, but I should be finished in a few months. I'm on my websites, AleliaBundles.com, where you can find a blog and videos and articles, and MadamCJWalker.com. You can sign up for our newsletter. Our first one went out today, and Phil, you're at the top of the newsletter promoting today's conversation.
Thank you.
So, so we're trying to get our newsletter act together.
Okay.
And on my website there is a list of my speeches. Obviously things are different because we're going through this crisis right now, but once we get to the other side of it, I will start doing more public events again.